Greetings. Welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Rose-Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or SKPCAP. Today, Merek Wigness will be speaking about the genetic legacy of the 1880s near extinction of bison. Before we get started, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they've worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. I'd like to let everyone know that our October webinar will be by Ducks Unlimited, and it's about their new biodiversity assessment tool. You can register or find out more information about our webinars on the PCAP website. And all of our webinars are recorded and should be available on the SKPCAP YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/user/SKPCAP. And a reminder to all of our attendees out there, you'll be muted for the duration of the presentation. But if you have any questions, just type it into the Q&A section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation, and questions will be answered towards the end of the webinar. And I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, North American Helium, Pembina, Saskatchewan Cattle Association, and SaskTel. Our supporting sponsors are the Innovation Credit Union and Ranchers Stewardship Alliance, Inc. In-kind support has been provided by Merek Wigness. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker. Merek has been involved in plant research with Agriculture Canada in Saskatoon for over 20 years. He's also been actively involved with bison on his family bison ranch. And Merek is the vice president of the Saskatchewan Bison Association, as well as a director with the Canadian Bison Association. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Merek.
Okay. Thanks, Caitlin. Okay, just 1 second here. Trying to get this all lined up. Yeah, so thanks, Caitlin, for the invite to speak here. This picture I'm showing is from our family bison ranch south of the Swift Current. We do have some really amazing native grass ecosystems down at the ranch, and we've ran as high as 600 head of grazing bison, but down to a couple hundred head during some of these drought years. So the relationship between the bison and the native grasslands is also a really interesting story, but that's a story for a different day. So today I'm going to talk to you about bison history and bison genetics. So this will just kick off into it. So to step back a long ways in time, the ancestral homeland of bison actually isn't in North America. It's in Eurasia, and bison only came to North America over the Bering Land Bridge. So this bison in the middle here, called bison priscus, that's also known as the steppe bison, and they're the ones that came over the Bering Land Bridge about 160,000 years ago in the first case. I think there was a couple waves of them that came over. The most recent one was maybe about 25,000 years ago. So you can see that in North America, the bison have evolved through several different species with some different morphology. You can see here on the left-hand side, this bison latifrons, this giant longhorn bison. It would be so amazing to have a time machine and be able to go back in time to the era when those animals lived, because there was some terrifying predators back then, like the saber-toothed tiger and dire wolves and like huge short-faced bear. So it would be so interesting to go back in time and to see how those animals interacted. Just looking at those horns on that bison, I don't think, so modern day bison, one of the characteristic behaviors is the fact that they'll group up into a tight group and they'll run like the wind in response to a predator. But those bison latifrons, I don't think they could form a really tight group and run really quickly, because there'd be unintentional injuries across the different bison in the group. So I'm not sure what behavior they had. Maybe they would stand and fight against a predator. There's probably no way we'll ever really know. But it would be so amazing to go back in time and to see how these things interacted. Stepping forward to the historic era, this picture here is a painting done by George Carlin, who was a famous painter that came out west in the 1830s. So you can see some of these brave hunters here coming up on the edge of a giant bison herd, and you can kind of get a sense for the scale of the bison herd itself. Um, there's lots of interesting testimonials of some of these huge bison herds in the past. Um, there was in 1871 there was a testimonial by Bill Alloway in the Capel Valley, where they said the bison herd took 24 hours to pass, and it was going at a fairly good lope. So the estimated herd size would have been just shy of 1 million animals in that herd. There also were interesting stories from the Lakota. Apparently, in their oral histories, they would measure the herd size by the number of days it would take for the bison herd to pass. So you can get a sense for the size of these herds. They were truly immense. And the general numbers for the herd size range from maybe 30 million to 60 million animals. So, it's a big number, but I've heard some people speculate that they think that it might have been the largest ungulate herd in the history of the entire world, which is a really bold statement, and there's no way to know if it's really true. But the logic behind that statement is the fact that during the extinction that happened in the late Pleistocene, about 11,000 years ago, there used to be a lot more large grazing animals in North America that were lost in that extinction event. So there used to be like mammoths and mastodons and horses and camels and tapirs, and like there was a lot of diversity of grazing animals back in the old days, like over 12,000 years ago. And the fact that a lot of those other large grazers were wiped out in that extinction kind of meant that most of North America was almost like a vacuum, as far as there wasn't a lot of competition between large grazers, and the bison were able to step into that vacuum essentially, and they were the dominant large grazer in North America. So my point as far as the genetics of the whole thing is the fact that, like, in such a large herd for many thousands of years, it was bigger than just like a gene pool. You could call it a gene ocean. Like, the genetics would have been very broad and a huge gene pool essentially. To step up to the era of the extermination of the bison around the 1880s. So there's a lot of history books written about this era because it was such an important period in our modern history. I would recommend reading some of the history books, because generally the history books are very well written. Although I have to say that, like, the stories are very dark. Like, it's kind of a depressing subject matter. So if you're feeling a little bit depressed, I wouldn't recommend reading about it. But it's a very interesting time period, and there's some really interesting stories of things that happened back in the old days. Um, One of the most important history books ever written was one of the first ones, which was written by this William Hornaday. It's this book here on the left called The Extermination of the American Bison. And it was actually published in 1886, so almost during the event. And so William Hornaday, he worked for the Smithsonian Institute, and was kind of obviously knowledgeable about history. And the book itself is very detailed, and it's a great resource. Um, yeah, some people say that it's maybe the first book on American wildlife conservation ever truly written, but it does kind of document what happened. It was around the year 1870 when the slaughter really kind of kicked off into large scale. And there's some estimates that say that about 5,000 bison were killed every single day of the year for about the period from 1870 until about 1885 or so. So, like, it was an immense slaughter. And it was kind of a perfect storm of events too. Like, the American Civil War had just finished, so there was a bunch of military people that had kind of were moving west to try and create a life for themselves. They had also created the Sharps rifle, There's a 40 or 50 caliber rifle, which was a very accurate long distance rifle that the buffalo hunters would use very effectively during the bison hunting. So you can see here on this map how the bison were kind of slaughtered down into just a few pockets of animals by 1889. So yeah, like I said, there's some really disturbing and amazing stories that come out of this time period. But so one interesting story, like there's many interesting stories, but I'll just tell one of them. So William Hornaday worked for the Smithsonian Institute, and the Smithsonian Institute didn't really have a good display of bison, and because it was an iconic North American animal, they thought that they should go out and they should hunt some bison so they could make a display that they could have at the Smithsonian Institute. So this was right about the time when they were just about on the verge of extinction, and to modern conservation people, it's really a horrifying concept that the Smithsonian would send people out to hunt some bison, like when they're just about all gone anyway. And it kind of speaks to the fact that like there was an interesting, it was definitely a tragedy of the commons sort of a situation going on where um, there were so many people wanting to access the bison, which were a very valuable resource for many different people. And because it was essentially a wide open and unregulated um, thing that like if any individual chose not to go out and hunt them, then they just assumed that someone else would get them. So there was no incentive to not hunt them, which is, you know, tragedy of the commons is it's a very perverse sort of a thing. So the Smithsonian did send people out and William Hornaday out to try and hunt one of the last bison herds. And in his memoirs, he says like it was with a heavy heart that they went out to try and capture some of these or to shoot some of these animals. And the story is kind of sad, or it's interesting because so he came out to central Montana. They were able to find one of the last wild bison herds, and they shot it was 40 animals, I think. And it was kind of late in the day when they did that, and they thought that they didn't have enough time to process the hides and everything. So they said that they would come back early the next morning and get to work. But during that evening, there was a local Blackfoot tribe who had must have known that they were out there, and they came up during the night and they harvested the meat and like the marrow from the bones, and they took the tongue from one of these old bulls in particular. But to make the story really poignant, they had left the head of the bull intact, and they had painted half of the bull's head yellow, and they painted the other half of the bull's head red, and they left a red flannel piece of fabric on the one horn. And as they wrote the story, they said it was like a symbol of defiance or something like that. But you can imagine what a sad, sad event that was for everybody involved. Essentially, how you know, one of the last true bison hunts that there ever was. But just so you don't think that Hornaday was a bad person, after that event, he was actually a really important person in the resurgence of bison, and he was one of the founding members of the American Bison Society, which was this large nonprofit organization that focused or based out of eastern the United States that was quite instrumental in helping to bring the bison back. There's a couple more interesting historical books written about that era. Um, these two books kind of focus on the market economy aspects of what was going on. So the book here on the left talks about the pemmican enterprise, because in the southern states or in the United States, it was mostly the hides that were the valuable thing, and they shipped literally millions of hides to Europe. And the hides were used in Europe during the Industrial Revolution because bison leather is so durable and tough. They would use it in the belting material for some of their factory machines. So the hide trade was a lucrative thing. But in Canada, it wasn't so much the hide trade as it was the pemmican trade. So the pemmican was like one of the main fuel sources for the whole voyageur economy with the Hudson Bay Company. So voyageurs would eat pemmican almost exclusively as they were rowing all the rivers up to the Western Plains. They and the pemmican was such a nutrient dense and high calorie food because it was had a lot of bison tallow in the pemmican. So a typical voyageur would only eat maybe 2 pounds of pemmican in a day, and that was all that they ate. So the analogy would be to the modern day it was almost like oil or something like that, which drove the economy. Back in those days, it was pemmican which drove the economy, which is kind of it's an interesting thing. Um, the book here on the right was written fairly recently. It was so Bill Weiser is a famous historian from the University of Saskatchewan, and he was the editor and together this compilation of essays, which again, it's a very interesting story. And Weiser was kind of focusing on the market economy aspects of the entire slaughter. So moving past the horrific slaughter and moving into the recovery of the bison populations, we have this graph here from a scientific paper done a couple of years ago, which I know it's kind of a busy and complicated graph, but it charts the founding animals that made it through the bottleneck and where they all went and how there was the creation of these park herds and the foundation herds, which kind of led us into the modern day recovery. This chart here kind of shows how it all happened. There's seven different groups of bison that were saved and made it through the bottleneck. But I would like to highlight a lot of these individual founding herds were saved essentially by individuals, and the group of individuals that did the saving, it's a important group of people. I find it's fairly diverse group. I'll just walk through a few of the individuals. One was Scotty Phillips. He was a Scottish rancher from South Dakota who saved a few animals. There was Samuel Walking Coyote from the Flathead Reservation in Montana who saved a few animals. There was Pablo Allard. There's two guys in Montana who created this very important herd, the Pablo Allard herd. And they were both Métis. One was French Canadian Métis, and the other guy was Mexican Métis. There's also the Charles Goodnight. Charles Goodnight is like a famous historical Western figure from Texas. His memoirs were the inspiration for the Western series called Lonesome Dove. So he was a famous person regardless of the saving bison. But apparently the story goes that it was his wife, Molly, who encouraged Charles Goodnight to try and go out and save some bison. So Molly Goodnight and Charles Goodnight played a big role. In Canada, there was Charles McKay and Charlie Alloway from Manitoba, a couple guys involved with the military who saved a few animals. But my point is that these individuals that kind of stepped up and went out and saved a few calves, we really should be grateful for what they ended up doing, because those different pockets of animals saved from different geographic locations, they end up being a hugely important aspect and important to the genetic diversity that we have nowadays that made it. So here's a table showing the different foundation bison herds. These are the bison herds that would be contributing genetics to mostly the private herds that exist nowadays. Just if everyone knows, about 95% of the bison nowadays are actually held in privately owned herds. So there's maybe 400,000 to 500,000 bison out there altogether, and about 20,000 of them are in like state or government controlled conservation herds in some of the different parks. But the rest of them are all, privately owned. And as you look through this table, you'll probably notice that there's very few animals that were the foundation of a lot of these important herds. Like, for example, Yellowstone has only 25 original animals plus some Pablo Allard that they had added in, and 3 goodnight animals. I think that was the entire source of the foundation of the Yellowstone herd. And altogether here, there's about 200 bison, which are the genetic foundation of modern day bison. And yeah, so just looking at this chart, you can intuitively, you would think that it was a very severe bottleneck, and not a lot of bison made it through the 1880s bottleneck. So intuitively, it seems that we would have a large genetic diversity issue in bison, and that's kind of what everyone assumed for a long time. But I'm going to move forward here to the modern time. So in 2016, the Canadian Bison Association did a genomics project. I have to do a shout out to the past president of the Canadian Bison Association, Sharif Fahmy. It was him who kind of pushed this through. So they wrote a grant and kicked in some money from the Canadian Bison Association. They received about $300,000 administered from Genome Canada for this work, kind of with Agriculture Canada. And with this genomics project, we did full genome sequencing on 41 genetically diverse bison. We collaborated with Dr. James Dare from the Texas A&M, who had a good selection of American Plains bison genetics. And also, Sharif got to go into the Natural History Museum in Ottawa and went into the basement and took some bone samples to try and get some DNA of some historic bison that we included in this full genome sequencing project. So we worked with Neogen, who is the largest animal genetics company globally and a very knowledgeable company when it comes to animal genetics. So we were able to develop 3 different commercially available tests. They're all SNP-based. So the first test is a parentage test, which you can use to determine the mother and the father of an individual bison calf. Uses 182 SNPs. We also developed a Woods Plains subspecies composition test, which yeah, so the Wood Plains subspecies composition, this was the main objective of this project. And it was a very important test to develop so that we could clearly differentiate the pure woods and the pure plains animals, because the woods plains crosses are fairly commonly used in the ranching community. So to try and differentiate a low percentage woods cross from a pure plains became a really important issue. And the test was very successful in being able to clearly sort of resolve that issue. We also developed a cattle introgression test, which has 10,000 SNPs in it. So it's like 10,000 individual markers, which was a big improvement compared to the previous cattle introgression test out there was based off of 25 different microsatellites. So 10,000 markers versus 25 markers, like theoretically would be 400 times more powerful than the previous test. So it's a useful test giving interesting information. But one of the outcomes of this genome sequencing project was out of the 41 full genome sequences, we came up with a number of 53 million SNPs across the entire group. So SNP, it's a single nucleotide polymorphism. It's like a single base pair change in the DNA. And while genetic diversity doesn't exclusively have to be comprised of SNPs, I'd say SNPs are like the bread and butter of genetic diversity. So trying to measure the number of SNPs as a proxy for genetic diversity, it's a very effective way to do it. So anyway, we found 53 million SNPs across the bison. Seems like a pretty high number, but what does it really mean? So to compare to cattle, cattle have been doing full genome sequencing for quite a while. It's kind of been a continuous project. They call it the 1,000-bull genome project. And by 2019, they had done full genome sequencing on 2,600 different cattle from the Bos genus. They had done sequencing off of 2,200 Bos taurus individuals. So the Bos taurus is basically European cattle, and they'd done sequencing those individuals comprise 61 different breeds of cattle. So you have like the main dairy cattle like Holstein and Brown Swiss, and then the big beef herds like Angus and Simmental, down to some obscure animals like the Wagyu and the Piedmontese. And across those 61 different breeds, they only found 40 million SNPs within all the Bos taurus animals. So our 41 bison have more genetic diversity than all the European cattle that there are, which frankly was very surprising. No one really expected to see that. The Bull Genome, or the Thousand Bull Genome Project, also did sequencing across some other species in the Bos genus, like the Bos indicus, some of the Brahma, and some of the Indian breeds. They also include some African breeds, like some of those obscure ones that have like the huge horns, different African breeds of cattle. They also included yak, which would have also added some diversity, and they included some auroch samples, which are the progenitor of modern day cattle. And out of the entire group of the Bos genus, they only found 84 million SNPs. So 84 million SNPs is higher than the 53 million we found. But the thing is we've only sequenced 41 bison, and I don't think we completely captured the diversity across all the bison. So as we would sequence more bison, that number of the 53 million number is going to increase. I'm not sure if it's going to increase to surpass 84 million SNPs or not, but it might get close, or it might even surpass it. But we won't know until later on. But it's a comparable number, so it's really shocking that the bison have as much diversity as this really diverse genus of animals. And it also brings up this question of hybrid vigor, I find, because in the cattle industry, they use hybrid vigor quite a lot, and they've done a lot of work to characterize hybrid vigor, and they came up with strategies to try and optimize it, where they can do like two-way crosses and three-way crosses and even four-way crosses, trying to like maintain maximal hybrid vigor across the cattle as a tool. So I think, although I'm speculating now, I think in bison we would also have some hybrid vigor. No one's actually proven this, but I would say like between the woods and the plains bison, I'm quite confident that there is hybrid vigor. And I'd also speculate that across some of the different plains groups, you could also get hybrid vigor. Yeah, when we were doing the project with Neogen, it was really interesting because we Neogen had this amazing software to like characterize what we were seeing, and it was like a three-dimensional principal component graph where they would cluster the different genetic groups of bison together, and you could see that the largest genetic distance was between the woods and the plains, but across different plains groups there was also some genetic distance there. On the wood side, it was really just one group, which, given the nature of the wood bison history, it kind of makes sense. So yeah, to continue the story of woods and plains, these two pictures here kind of show some really typical woods and plains. I'm gonna just talk about the differences between woods and plains a little bit, because before this genomic work that we did, actually, someone years ago had written a paper speculating that epigenetics played a large role in the difference between woods and plains, and that idea was really pushed really heavily for a long time, even though it's not that hard to clearly disprove that it wasn't true. So anyway, I'd say that with the genomic project that we did, we were able to clearly show that there is a genetic difference between plains and woods. Looking at these two pictures of animals, for someone with a trained eye for bison who looks at them a lot, like there's a lot of differences here. I know for people that don't look at bison every day, they don't really look that different from each other. But the Canadian Bison Association has developed this phenotypic tool to try and differentiate woods and plains bison. And there's a few like kind of distinguishing characteristics here. For example, on the plains bison, the peak of the hump is usually behind the shoulders, where on the woods bison, the peak of the hump is ahead of the shoulders. On the plains bison, you usually get a more distinguished or clearly differentiated cape, like the longer hair kind of going up on the shoulders and the back, and then how it slicks off, and the back half of the bison is a kind of a distinguishing characteristic of plains bison. The woods bison don't really have such a clearly defined cape. The the beard and the chaps on the plains bison are usually like the chaps are the long hair on the front legs, and some plains bison will have really tremendously long chaps, whereas the woods tend to not have long hair, as long of hair for the chaps. But woods, they are a taller animal, so the legs are often a little bit longer. And anyway, so there's a number of phenotypic differences between woods and plains. I'm going to tell the story of the Wood Buffalo National Park. So there was this thing that happened in the 1920s where they brought up over almost 7,000 plains bison from Wainwright up to Wood Buffalo National Park. So it was a disaster essentially on multiple levels. Basically, they by bringing up a bunch of plains bison up to the homelands of the woods bison, they the hybridization kind of wiped out the true genetics they were existed up there. So yeah, they not only did they kind of destroy the pure woods genetics, they lost. It was the largest plains herd in the world at that time. It was the remnants of the Pablo Allard herd, and there's a lot of like valuable genetics within that herd, which were also essentially lost for the time being anyway. They also introduced disease up to Wood Buffalo National Park, which has been a huge issue with the brucellosis and tuberculosis, and now they can't bring any genetics out of the park again, although they're working on strategies to try and get around that. But yeah, essentially it was a disaster. So at the time they brought the bison up, there was only about 1,500 wood bison up there. And if all the plains bison survived, which most certainly they did not all survive because it would have been a very stressful transportation event. But if they had all survived, only 18% of that original herd composition would have been woods, like broadly speaking, in 1928. So the bison, there's this big genetics project called the Bison Integrated Genomics Project, which was a $5 million Genome Canada project here that's kind of just winding down. It's just happening right now. And some of the unpublished results coming out of that have been analyzing the genetics of the Wood Buffalo National Park herd. And although there's a few distinct herds up in that area, because it's a huge area the size of Switzerland, I think some of this now in Maine, I believe the Maine herd, which is kind of larger and further north, is showing around 82% woods genetic heritage right now. So it just raised this really interesting question. I think that there's a selective pressure in favor of the woods genetics, given the fact that it is the homeland of the woods bison. And it's certainly, from an evolutionary perspective, wouldn't be surprising that that environment would favor the woods to do better up there. I have to say, like, back to the historical event, because what they did is they trucked the almost 7,000 bison by train up to around Fort McKenzie, and then they loaded them onto barges and they ran the barges up the Athabasca River for like 1,200 kilometers or so. So like the logistics of trying to move 700 or 7,000 bison in the 1920s would have been, a huge project. But apparently one of the government officials who was involved in the decision making also happened to own the company that ran all the barges up to the Wood Buffalo Park. So there was a conflict of interest in there, which might have been one of the reasons why they made such a disastrous decision. But so this satellite image kind of shows a big picture of Western Canada. You can see in Saskatoon, we're kind of on the north end of the Great Plains, and bison, they really are a grassland specialist, and that's the core of their ecological niche is grassland specialization. And up in Wood Buffalo National Park, you can see it's kind of like the most northernmost fragments of true grassland in North America are up in Wood Buffalo National Park. Even though it's mostly a forested area up there, you can see from the satellite map, the environment up in Wood Buffalo Park is quite different than the Great Plains. Here's a good representative picture of Wood Buffalo National Park. Like it's more of a forested kind of upland sort of thing, but they have a lot of big marshy areas where, and it's kind of like the lowland marshy areas that most, there's a lot of the grass and sedges are down in those low areas. So you can you can see that the environment up there, it's different than the Great Plains essentially. Certainly a lot of winter, like it's a or like a subarctic boreal environment. And the winter, it's a very long winter, like only about 6 hours of sunlight during the winter. And I kind of, my own personal speculation is that the forage quality during the winter would probably be a little bit on the low side. Like the nutritional quality would be on the low side compared to the Great Plains, like the area that we ranch in. Like we're in kind of a mixed grassland area ourselves, and those native grasses, when they naturally cure, they're actually fairly high protein, fairly nutritious grass for the winter. Whereas up in the northern areas, they get a higher volume of grass, but it's lower protein quality grass, which makes it harder for the animals to survive in the winter. So those woods bison would have adapted. Apparently, they ate willow and they ate silverberry leaves. So clearly, it's a pretty harsh environment up there for the winter, and those woods bison would have been specially adapted in order to do well up in that environment. Behavior-wise, the comparison between woods and plains bison. So I've got some unpublished data here provided by Wes Olson. Thanks, Wes. But so Wes used to be the warden for the Elk Island National Park. And the Elk Island National Park sort of is running a really, it's almost like a perfect natural experiment where on the park has a highway going through the middle of it, and on one side of the highway they have a pure woods herd, and on the other side they have a pure plains herd, but it's effectively the same environment. So they're able to compare the differences in behavior and any other differences between the two herds under the same environmental conditions. So Wes had run this little study where that they were recording the number of times the bulls would roar during the breeding season. So the plains bulls are, it's one of their defining characteristics is during the breeding season, the bulls roar. And if you've never had the chance to see it, it's really an amazing thing. I would recommend going to one of the parks during the breeding season to catch the natural rut where the bulls are roaring and fighting. It's an amazing thing to see. It's a guttural, almost like a lion. It's a very loud roar that the bison bulls do. So the plains bison were roaring at about 6 times per minute out of a group of 45 bulls. Whereas on the woods herd, basically they didn't roar at all. They only roared, 7, it was roars per minute. It was less than 0.01 roars per minute, according to this data. So it's a good example of a specific behavioral difference between the woods and the plains. From our general experience with plains bison, like generally in the plains environment, our bison, which we have a plains herd, so they prefer to go and find an open hilltop and they'll relax up there and they watch for predators. And from what I know, like the plains bison, if they have the choice, they don't really like going into wooded areas. Whereas my understanding is that the woods bison are more comfortable in a treed environment. I've also, it seems like the woods bison have a stronger fight or flight response. And for the woods bison that would be hanging out in a treed, shrubby environment, It's certainly a possibility that a bear or some other predator could ambush and attack them. So they would have to have like a very quick and immediate sort of fight or flight response to the ambush predators in that environment. Where is in the open plains, they can usually see the predators coming, so they kind of have a different sort of attitude around that. So the other big genetic question is cattle introgression in bison, and this is kind of a controversial topic, or it's gotten controversial the last several years. So back in the 1880s, people experimented with crossing bison to cattle. They didn't really know if it was a good cross or not, so it seemed like a reasonable thing to at least try out, and they did try it, and they ended up finding that the cross, because the most recent common ancestor between cattle and bison is about 1 million years ago. So they're far enough apart that the cross has some genetic problems with it. So when they were doing like the F1 first generation cross, they would get a lot of aborted fetuses, and they would have very few male calves. They'd have more female calves. And a lot of any of the males that did survive to calf stage, a lot of them were sterile, whereas the females were fertile. So, there's some problems with the cross essentially. Um, and I guess so. I don't necessarily object to the fact that they tried crossing it. Where the problems came in is where some of these low percentage, like, so they did the first generation cross and then they back crossed it to bison, and they ended up with some of these animals that looked like a bison, or looked very much like a bison, and some of these animals kind of snuck in and were kept as part of these original foundation herds. And then there's this thing in genetics called the founder effect, where basically those few animals that were crossed to cattle broadly distributed their genetics into these new new herds in the modern sort of bison genetics. Live when they did the first like modern sort of molecular evidence came up showing, so they were able to find a couple of different cattle mitochondria in Custer State Park. They found two out of 30 bison from Custer State Park turned out to have cattle mitochondria. And because the mitochondria are kind of like a special thing when it comes to genetics, because they're only passed from mother to her offspring. And so you get these really clear lineages happening, and it doesn't get muddled at all. Like most of the genomic DNA kind of gets muddled and it gets complicated because you have genetic influence from both the mother and the father. With mitochondria, you only have the mother's influence. So yeah, it's a very interesting genetic tool that clearly shows lineages, and it's also it's essentially like a smoking gun. It's very rock solid genetic evidence that that there was a crossing event with cattle, and yeah, there's no refuting it from a genetics perspective. Um, so nowadays, I'm going to talk about a couple of different scientific papers. There was a scientific paper that came out in 2022 out of Dr. Dare's group at Texas A&M, and he made this broad generalization saying that all modern bison have at least a small amount of cattle introgression in them. And I know it was a really bold statement because it kind of changed what seemed to be the current consensus on the whole situation. And it was a controversial claim, and the evidence was kind of weak. So some people were encouraged to try and like revisit that whole question. And luckily, this Bison Integrated Genomics project did a lot of like full genome sequencing, mainly focused on the woods bison the Woods Buffalo National Park and the Elk Island Plains bison as well. So a lot of this work is coming out of this really good bioinformatics lab at the University of California, Santa Cruz, with like Beth Shapiro and Jonas Oppenheimer. So I was able to catch Jonas's talk in Denver here this last year, where he was able to show clearly that they were able to clearly show a lot of, almost all the bison in those parks seem to have zero cattle introgression in them, and it raised the question of how the bioinformatics sort of went wrong with this report out of Texas A&M. They were able. There's a paper that is supposed to be coming out in the next month or two that they're going to try and refute this recent Dr. Dare paper, and they're going to be able to show that it was this thing called reference bias, which is kind of where the bioinformatics went off the rails with this previous analysis. But anyway, this is all coming down the pipe right now. I don't mean to be too hard on Dr. Dare's lab because they've done a lot of really good genetics work in the past. I'm going to talk about one of the papers he did that it's a very good paper, actually. It was done about 10 or 12 years ago, where they were able to show that the cattle mitochondria in bison actually has a clean, statistically significant genetic effect, where basically if you have a group of bison and some of them have cattle mitochondria and some of them have bison mitochondria, that the ones that have cattle mitochondria are significantly smaller than the ones that have bison mitochondria, which, it's really interesting finding, I find. So with this Neogen test development, because I was on the committees that were involved with this entire project, and because I have a genetics background, I was quite involved with trying to do the validation steps. So when we were trying to validate the cattle introgression test, we took a whole extra year, and we were able to collect DNA samples from like 461 bison, and we were able to run it through the cattle introgression test and try and see if the test was giving good results or if there was some problems coming up with the test that didn't really make sense. And so this chart here is a histogram of that. The high bar on the left-hand side is a bison that seem to have very little or zero cattle introgression. And as you go over down the tail to the right-hand side, the ones on the far end, like those bison, there's only a few of them, have like over 4%, maximum like 4.5% cattle introgression. But, and so we did have a number of Parks Canada animals in this group, which maybe is like pushing up the left-hand bar here a little bit higher than it necessarily would be, because we have a lot of Elk Island Plains Park animals and a lot of grassland plains animals, as well as the Banff animals. And those bison, I'm quite confident, have zero cattle introgression. So that category kind of got bumped up a little bit higher. But you can see this beautiful mathematical trend in this data. And like as a science guy, whenever you do like a broad and messy sort of analysis and you get sort of like this clear mathematical trend coming out of it, it's very rewarding from the science nerd side, because it usually means that the data is telling you something profoundly true. And what this chart is showing us is that, like, yes, there's a bunch of bison on the right hand side that have cattle introgression, but like it's clearly a distribution, and the distribution is trending up towards the side that doesn't have any cattle introgression. So the take home message here is kind of along the lines of, I think that there's bison even within the privately owned animals that don't have any cattle introgression. You could, even if the test had a fairly high error rate, which, every test has an error associated with it, even with a high error rate, the trend line is still telling you something that's like, it's a very clear trend. But I know from the Neogen cattle introgression test that actually the error rate from what we were getting from Neogen's results was indicating that the error rate is actually very low. So I think there's something going on here. So in conclusion, an amazing amount of genetic diversity made it through the 1880s genetic bottleneck. We're we're truly lucky that that is the case. We should be thankful for the the fact that the founding herds kind of came from a geographically distributed um, group of areas is the reason why we have as much genetic diversity now as we do. So thank goodness for that. The woods and plains are distinct genetically, phenotypically, and behaviorally. And cattle introgression in bison certainly does exist, but it's not as broadly spread as we had recently thought it was. So with that, that's the end of my talk. I know there's a lot of information there, but if anyone has any questions, feel free.
First of all, thanks so much for the really informative presentation. And as you can guess, we've got a ton of questions for you already. Some kind of going back
Okay.
to the earliest point in the presentation. But
Yeah.
just a question from Erica. How large is the ranch where you graze your bison?
About 3,200 acres.
And compared to the number of bison to cattle, like animal units, how does that differ?
Well, we find, well, we're not grazing our bison the same as cattle. Like we tend to push the year-round grazing. We were running 3 herds, now we're down to 2 herds, but our one herd we graze almost 50 weeks of the year. So most cattle guys won't graze that long. And so yeah, the stocking rate kind of course, has to account for the extra long grazing season. But I don't know. In my experience, I'd say the bison are like they're a little bit more efficient, and the stocking rate would be you could stock them a little bit higher than you could cattle, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And Dina's wondering if you feed in the winter time, or you manage grass to be able to graze year round.
Yeah, if we have the grass, when we will like to try and graze year round, but it's kind of a seasonal thing. During some of those dry drought years we had recently, we didn't have enough grass to really graze into the winter, and then we have to feed them bales. But the majority of the last 10 years, we've been kind of doing a lot of winter grazing, which is great.
Absolutely. And another attendee says the bison were a keystone species for biodiversity and healthy lands. Does it kind of suggest that our land isn't very healthy now?
Oh man.
A
Yeah.
loaded question.
Yeah, there's so much variation in land management out there. Certainly some of it's not healthy, but I certainly know that like looking at cattle grazing, you know, the the range, like there's definitely some cattle managers who are amazingly good managers and they do excellent job and they have really awesomely healthy ranch lands, and then there's some who aren't, right? So yeah, it would range a lot. Hard to broadly generalize, I think.
Okay. Um, and Erica says if the Smithsonian only needed a display, why shoot the remaining 40 animals? They maybe could have found some hides to stock. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, no, that's a debatable thing. It seems like a bad idea to go out and shoot 40 of the last bison that were around. So yeah, you'd think there would have been an alternative. So I agree that it was a questionable decision.
It was a different era, I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And do cattle genes eventually get diluted out?
Yeah, like it gets so I don't mean to get too complicated, but there's this phenomenon called admixture linkage disequilibrium, where basically the the chunks, like after so many generations of back crossing, um, like the chunks of cattle DNA, they remain fairly large and intact, and it has to do with like homologous recombination frequency. And there's like some hot spots and some cold spots within a chromosome that'll recombination happens at a different rate in those different areas, basically. So you end up with these kind of distinct chunks of cattle DNA that'll segregate like from generation to generation as discrete chunks. And with the cattle integration test being fairly powerful is like you can basically track those pieces of DNA from generation to generation. Um, yeah, like so if you wanted to use that tool, you could maybe select against the cattle, like those chunks of cattle DNA. But I don't know if there would be selective pressure against it generally. Like if you weren't doing any sort of selection along those lines, probably it would just maintain, those. If it's 1% cattle or so, it would just hold that sort of a trend line. But using the genetic test that we have, you can try and select against it if you wanted to. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
I think so. And then another attendee is wondering if you think culling of bison with cattle introgression could cause a significant loss of genetic diversity.
yeah, absolutely. That's a very good point. You wouldn't want to go. It's like potentially you'd be throwing the baby away with the bathwater because like the genetic diversity issue is it's still a real issue. And although we have more genetic diversity than we kind of thought, you wouldn't want to like eliminate a whole group of animals because they had cattle integration because you'd also be eliminating like that extra genetic diversity that was within that group. So you're absolutely right. You'd have to be careful about like selecting strongly against cattle integration.
Yeah. And Penny is wondering if there's a difference in metabolic rates between cattle and bison. She heard that bison metabolism actually drops in the winter. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, no, that's correct. I know when the weather gets really, really cold, cattle, like often you have to feed them more in order for them to, keep the furnace burning and for them to stay warm during the cold weather. Bison, it's a bit complicated because their insulation is a lot better as well. But I think it is partly true that during the cold weather, like they tend to slow down and their metabolism would kind of be slower compared to cattle anyway. So yeah, I think that's right.
Okay, that makes sense. And Mark is wondering, are there historical indications of phenotypic or genetic types of bison across North America?
In the historical records, there's a lot of discussion about different sort of like regional types of bison. Like there is a lot of discussion around these mountain bison, and I've seen images of bison that were out on the eastern seaboard that kind of looked different. And apparently, back in the day, they had a whole pile of um, different bison species that they had created, thinking, back before they had really good, modern genetics or anything to try and evaluate if it was a true species or not. But unfortunately, a lot of those like maybe regionally distinct bison were lost during the 1880s. So it's hard to really know like what exactly was going on. Like was there more subspecies around back then that were lost,
Hmm.
or was it just an artifact of the historical records? We'll probably never really know, but there's certainly the possibility that that was true. Yeah.
Thanks for that answer. And our final question from Anthony. Anthony says, I'm from Metawistis First Nation. We spent years preparing to return buffalo to our lands. We are about an hour drive north of Saskatoon. So we're at the kind of the northern traditional range of the Plains bison. And a Southern
Mhm.
First Nation is offering a hybrid, a Plains and wood bison. And I believe that we should have Plains as pure as possible. And what are your thoughts on that? And they're hoping to allow their herd to be as free as possible and to roam and
Yeah, like it's a kind of it's a decision for your tribe or whoever is making that decision. It's kind of a value judgment decision to be made, and there's arguments both ways. But I personally would suggest like if you especially if you already have a plains foundation herd, like trying to maintain that plains herd by bringing in some unrelated plains genetics like there's certainly a case to be made that that's a good path forward. There's a case to be made about bringing in some hybrid vigor with the woods cross as well. So yeah, like uh, you know, personally, because we raise plains, I would say that bringing in some plains animals is a good idea, but it's, you could argue both sides of that case, and it's a decision, it's a value call that you'll just have to make.
No wrong answer, it sounds like.
Yeah, there's different ways to look at it. But
Yeah. I just wanted to pass on that we've had lots of comments coming in from our attendees. Fabulous presentation. Thank you so much. Michael says it was very interesting and thank you. Great presentation, excellent presentation. So lots of great comments coming in. So I just want to say thank you so much, Merek. We really appreciate you taking the time to tell us about bison genetics today.
yeah, for sure, Caitlin. Thanks again for inviting me. So yeah, this is great.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for catching our live broadcast today, everyone. We have recorded and we will get it online in the near future. When you leave today's webinar, there'll be a quick 1-minute survey. And as always, if you don't mind filling that out, we really appreciate it. So with that, thank you so much and have a great rest of your day, everyone. Bye.